In the Quran, we read, Jesus is a good prophet, he is not God. The problem is the historical Jesus claimed to be God.
That could be an internal contradiction. Is on one page it says something, on a different page it says something else. Like the gentleman that left mentioned about the creation.
You're right.
Creation came
The
about.
Quran does not contradict itself. I agree.
They can only be used to a certain degree before they start becoming unhealthy, we'll say.
Now, you've got to answer the question, if you're going to be intellectually consistent and honest, what is the option that is supported by more evidence than...
This atheist student launched a fierce attack on Cliffe Knechtle about the veracity of the Bible and why it should be trusted. The friendly gathering soon turned into an intense intellectual battle, with Cliffe firmly dismantling every argument thrown his way like a maestro on steroids, except the only steroids he's on is the hand of God working through him. And just as the student ended, another one came with a more complicated argument that almost threw Cliffe off. Make sure to watch till the end.
How do I talk to a guy who says, I don't believe in the rational, but we're going to try and have a rational conversation right now? I don't believe in the rational, but I'm going to try and put words together grammatically correctly. How do you talk to a guy who contradicts themselves so desperately that they're trying to maintain that they don't really trust reason, but all they're doing in their conversation with me is trusting reason? Is that not the height of intellect?
One of the doctrinal conflicts that arises between Christianity and some other religions is the concept of Christ as God. And it's the first jab this student threw at Cliffe. Watch how she asked for an explanation of the seeming contradiction in that theology and Cliffe Knechtle's response to it.
He is not God. The problem is the historical Jesus claimed to be God.
That could be an internal contradiction. Is on one page it says something, on a different page it says something else. Like the gentleman that left mentioned about the creation.
You're right.
Creation came
the
about.
Quran does not contradict itself. I agree.
So then
but
we'll
it
go to
contradicts
point number
the
two.
historical evidence that Jesus claimed to be God.
Claimed. From what, John and Joseph and Mike and whoever?
That's right, man. And that's the only thing. That's the only way I can know anything historically. Historical knowledge is based on the trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony.
So then why take what John and those people said 500 years before what Muhammad came with?
But before we move to the most hectic part of his takedown, let's quickly pan to this other student asking a very poignant question, one that many atheists love to ask. How can you believe in a God you cannot see? But what happened next? It changed everything.
If you hate your father and mother, you cannot be my disciple. You respect that kind of madman? I don't respect that kind of madman who says, let the dead bury their own dead, who throws over violently the money changers' desks in the temple and whips them. I don't respect that kind of guy.
Yeah.
Nope.
I respect the sort of his strength in willing to be himself wholeheartedly, especially in the denial of all the order in his time.
Doesn't he just contradict himself all the time? I mean,
Again, the student tried to tackle one of the biggest objections, miracles, asking if science has never proven a miracle. Why should we believe they happen?
came as a slave and yet he claims to be God? Sounds like a contradiction to me.
Well, that's a rational rule. I'm fine with contradiction. I allow it. I like it.
You have an irrational lunatic.
Cliffe smiled and relayed that if miracles could be tested by science, they wouldn't be miracles.
And that's kind of the point of having God.
Nobody out here is trying to rationalize miracles.
Well, I'm not trying to accuse anyone of that. I'm just saying I've seen it like online and other places.
Oh, okay, fine. If you and I are standing under an apple tree, an apple disengages from the branch 100 times out of 100, that apple is going to do what? It's going to hit the ground. Gravity works 100 times out of 100. But if I reach out with my hand and catch the apple, it's not going to hit the ground. That's the introduction of a hand to catch the apple to prevent it from hitting the ground. A miracle is simply a claim that there is a supernatural God who can intervene and change the apple from hitting the ground. That's a miracle. It is not a denial of the laws of nature. The New Testament does not, and the Bible does not deny the laws of nature. But it does say there is a supernatural hand that can intervene and perform what you and I call a miracle. God is not against nature. He's the creator of nature. Now, when he performs a miracle in Mary's womb and she conceives without having sex with Joseph, that is not saying for the next 9 months, God performed miracle after miracle after miracle in Mary's womb. No, the natural process took over. The fetus grew, became a baby that was born. But the initial conception was definitely a miracle. Meaning by that, it did not follow what naturally happens. No problem.
By the end of his explanation, the students were utterly dumbfounded. They had no response. The logic was too solid to ignore. But brace up, because that wasn't all.
What are you living for?
I get my value of my life. I believe, well, we mentioned Nietzsche. I'm quite a follower of Nietzsche. So I believe in the eternal recurrence of all things. So that either creates your own hell in life if you don't live your life the way you want to, or it creates your own paradise. And so writing is whenever I feel fulfilled. It's whenever I challenge myself and attack myself to make myself stronger. And I often do attack my atheistic beliefs as well. So
what's the evidence that writing is going to produce paradise?
There is no evidence, but I sure do like the feeling.
Good. Thanks for your honesty.
Yeah.
I like the feeling. What do you say to me if the purpose of my life is to get high? Because I like the feeling.
I view that a bit different. Because, I'm not a hedonist. I don't like hedonism. But I do believe there is a certain type of higher pleasure wherein you do overcome things. You overcome challenge and adversity. And I think that, I do feel that I do that in my writing, especially if I have like a writer's block. It's very difficult to try to come up with something. But if I keep on working at it, the feeling of overcoming that and reaching a new conclusion that I never thought of.
The confrontation then took a personal turn. The student argued that he found meaning in his own way, through art, relationships, and personal goals. He asserts that he doesn't need God to find purpose. But Cliffe leaned in, asking him what happens when those things fail. The student hesitated.
Thought of before.
Good.
Enough.
And by putting words together in a rational order, you can communicate. And that is beautiful.
It is.
Now, is it more reasonable to think that behind your rational mind and your rational writing is an accidental collection of atoms, or is it more reasonable to believe that behind your rational mind is a rational being, God?
I don't really like either of those pathways, because you either get causes ad infinitum, the infinite reduction of causes, or you get a prime mover, i.e. God. And both of those logically don't really make sense to me. Having an uncaused cause or having an infinite regression of causes, both of those don't really make sense to me. So
it doesn't make sense to you? There has to be a rational mind?
Well, it's very similar to to Descartes' argument. I think, therefore I am. I don't
no, it's not.
You don't?
You're here to develop your rational mind. Now, come on, guys. Let's agree. We all have rational minds. Now, the question is it more plausible to believe that behind your rational mind is the non-rational or the irrational? Or is it more reasonable to believe that behind your rational mind is a rational God who gave you that ability to think rationally?
Cliffe continued, explaining that many people who base their lives on success, love, or creativity eventually found themselves in despair when those things were taken away. He let him understand that real purpose cannot be found in things that fade. If your meaning in life can be lost, then was it ever real to begin with?
Rational. Or is it more reasonable to believe that behind your rational mind is a rational God who gave you that ability to think rationally?
You could feel the weight of the question hanging heavily. As the discussion went deeper, the students admitted that both belief in God and atheism had logical difficulties. He continued by suggesting that an infinite chain of causes doesn't make sense, and neither does an uncaused creator. Then he asked to know where that leaves humanity.
I don't know, it might be a flaw of my own mind that I can't understand it.
All right.
I just
Subjective.
Cliffe answered with clarity, stating that something cannot come from nothing. The only rational explanation would be that an eternal, intelligent being exists beyond time and space.
It's very simple. It's in the beginning, there's nothing. You never, ever get something coming from nothing. That is impossible.
I don't think that there is an argument to say that there was nothing in the beginning.
Well, I
there
think
always
the
has-
Big Bang points to it. There was nothing. The fact that you love the irrational, there's nothing I can say to you. Because if I try and reason with you, you're just going to hit a wall and say, I don't trust reason. See how frustrating that is? I don't think that's a very wise way to live your life. You don't use reason and then all of a sudden say, no more reason. I just jump into the irrational. That's not a very reasonable way to live your life.
But the student wasn't having it, going on to ask who created God. At this point, Cliffe knew just what he wanted and gave it to him.
What if, just for sake of argument, reason led to you realizing that God did not exist?
Tell me what you believe. Tell me what you think. What do you think?
I don't think God exists.
Why?
It's just my feeling. I was raised in a
Okay.
Christian family, and I just.
But if I stood out here and you asked me, why do you think God does exist? And I said, because it's a feeling. God is a feeling I have. How would you respond to that?
I'd be fine with that.
You'd be fine with that? Well, I wouldn't. Because for all I know, if God is just a feeling I have, then maybe it's gas I'm having in my stomach. And I'm calling it God. You can't believe in something just because you have a feeling. You've got to get your brain in gear, and you got to ask, what's most reasonable? Not what can I prove? You can't prove anything. But the evidence of order and design pointing to a designer, moral absolutes pointing to a moral lawgiver, love pointing to a personal being who gives us the ability to love, meaning, the innate drive for meaning in life that even Nietzsche had, we all have, points us to the fact that we were probably created for a purpose. There is meaning to life.
Can you repeat what you said?
The student was presented with another simple analogy. He was assuming God is like everything else, something that was caused. Cliffe let him know that by definition, God is the uncaused first cause. If God needed a creator, he wouldn't be God.
The reason that I believe in God is because my atheist friends think that non-existence produces existence. That's a miracle. But my atheist friend has no miracle worker. The reason I believe there's a God is because my atheist friend thinks that chaos produces order. That's a miracle. But my atheist friend has no miracle worker.
Your belief is entirely rational, or would you say it's like a mix of faith and rational?
My relationship with you right now, you can communicate, you have a rational mind, but obviously I'm having to trust you. Now, we don't know each other very well, that's for sure, but if I had the opportunity to get to know you better, that would be a tremendous gift for me, and I would delight in listening to you, watching you, and getting to know you better. So reason is involved in our relationship. I have never met a person who can just consistently live according to their feelings. It's part of what it means to be a human being created in the image of God. You got a mind?
Once again, the argument collapsed under its own weight and died a natural death. But that's nothing compared to this next episode when Cliffe was confronted by another atheist student asking very weird questions.
Have you heard of like Schellenberg's non-resistant non-belief?
No, I haven't. What is that?
There's like 3 basic premises to the argument, but in general, he's saying that if God is all-loving, which in the Christian view he is,
Yes.
there's no reason for there to be people who are not resistant to the idea of God. Like, I would consider myself non-resistant. I'm personally an atheist because that's where the evidence has led me.
Right.
But I have put a lot of effort into trying to figure out the truth. And I would personally say that I'm not resistant to God, but yet I still don't believe in him. And how could an all-loving God allow a case like that to exist?
The moment you claim that Christianity lacks enough evidence, you place yourself in a position where an alternative must be defended. If Jesus is not the truth, then something else must be. Cliffe Knechtle makes this clear when he turns the argument back on the skeptic. It's easy to say that Christianity isn't convincing, but what takes its place? What belief system stands on firmer historical and philosophical ground?
I would argue that love demands free will. If it ain't free, it ain't love. It's manipulated, it's coerced, but it's not real love. I would argue to really love someone, you got to make a free decision.
The amount of effort that I've put in to figuring out Christianity, learning about Christianity, I personally wasn't raised with any religion.
Yes.
But for some reason, whatever reason, all the evidence that I've come across through
Yeah.
reading the Bible, going to church, talking to my Christian friends,
Yeah.
listening to debates,
Yeah.
something in my psyche has just told me that atheism is more convincing than theism. How is that my fault that the evidence was not convincing enough to me?
Okay, well, what do you mean when you say atheism is more convincing? How is atheism more convincing to you than Jesus?
The atheist student insists that she has sought the truth, examined the evidence, and found atheism more convincing. But here's where things take an unexpected turn. Cliffe challenges her to name something that has stronger supporting evidence than Christ, and suddenly, the certainty begins to waver. In rejecting Christianity, the student assumes a neutral ground exists, a space where he can simply say, "I'm just unconvinced." But neutrality is an illusion. To dismiss Christianity as insufficient is to suggest that something else, perhaps atheism or secular humanism, is a more reasonable choice. Yet, when pressed, no worldview is presented that surpasses the historical reliability of Jesus, the consistency of biblical teachings, or the evidence for the resurrection.
Yeah.
Something in my psyche has just told me that atheism is more convincing than theism. How is that my fault that the evidence was not convincing enough to me?
Okay, well, what do you mean when you say atheism is more convincing? How is atheism more convincing to you than
What happens next shifts everything. The discussion moves from personal belief to the nature of morality itself. The problem of animal suffering is brought up, a question that has long been used to challenge the idea of a good and loving God. If animals have no moral responsibility, why are they subjected to pain, starvation, and death? Doesn't this contradict the idea of divine justice? The argument seems strong, but then the floor is pulled from underneath it.
Christ?
There's a lot of things that I could say.
We'll just start at the top, the best reasons.
Sure. The first thing that comes to mind is the problem of animal suffering is really difficult to contend with in
Yeah.
religion.
Yes.
I know for the problem of evil, a lot of Christians say free will, which I understand that argument, but it becomes more difficult when you talk about animal suffering in the wild. That doesn't have any human influence, and why would a loving God allow the starvation, disease, predation on billions of animals every day? They're truly suffering.
Yes,
And
there
there's
is.
no promise of heaven for them because in the Christian view, animals don't have souls. So that just seems really unjust to me, and a loving God wouldn't create that.
Cliffe points out that even asking the question assumes an objective moral standard. Without God, suffering is simply a neutral part of existence. Nature is neither good nor evil. It just is. Evolution doesn't provide moral outrage. Yet the student is deeply disturbed by what he perceives as unnecessary suffering. But why? If the universe is nothing more than a random series of events, then suffering has no moral weight. To recognize suffering as wrong is to admit that there is a standard beyond human opinion, one that atheism cannot justify.
Okay, I respect your sensitive conscience. Who defines justice? Why are you so outraged that animals suffer innocently? If there is no God, what is? It's not good. It's not evil. You use the word evil. Who defines evil? If there is no God, evil is totally subjective, totally relative. It's a crapshoot.
In the atheist.
And just when the discussion seems to have settled, another issue arises. The concept of moral relativism is defended. The idea that morality is shaped by society, culture, and evolution. But here's where things go completely off script. If morality is relative, then one culture's definition of good and evil holds no more weight than another's.
Yeah, God clearly says, don't cause any animal to suffer. So yes, inflicting pain on animals is not good.
No, but I'm talking about just in nature, without human involvement. Do you think like a baby deer dying of a disease and suffering a slow death
Is bad.
Okay, so how does a Christian God contend with that?
It's not God who's causing an animal to suffer. It's not God who's causing a person to suffer. That's because they're born into an unfair, messed up world. It's a consequence.
But God is, in the Christian view, is always just and correct, and
God is just. Yes.
If animals don't have souls, they didn't. They don't have sin.
Yeah.
Which is typically like the Christian reason why humans suffer is because we're sinful. And
No.
we have free will.
No.
And we can choose our own.
No, ma'am. Just
But
read the book of
why-
Job. Job suffers. His buddies come to him and say, watertight case. We know why you're suffering, Job, because you sinned. Totally wrong. And the book of Job makes that crystal clear. When they told Job, hey, Job, we know why you're suffering. It's because you're a sinner. And if you just were to repent of your sin, you'd stop suffering. God was angry with them. They were lying. They were inaccurate. See, ma'am, you and I are born, and animals are born into an unfair, messed up world. And that's why you reel back with indignation, and that's good. You should. And that's why Jesus, when he walked on earth, healed the sick, raised the dead, fed the hungry, because he knew this ain't right. This is not good. This is lousy. You're absolutely correct, ma'am. But you see, if you're an atheist, you're wiping out the basis for understanding this sucks. This is horrible. Because what you're saying is, all of reality is a result of the evolutionary cycle. So this animal, the reason this animal suffers is because of evolution. That's despair if you think about it. I respect you a lot for the way you have just expressed moral outrage over innocent animal suffering. Bravo. But the whole basis of your outrage is a theistic worldview, which says there is a God who created things a certain way. Things got royally messed up. And now the question is, what's the solution to the mess?
The student wants to argue that Christian morality is flawed, yet his entire argument assumes an objective standard of right and wrong.
Just to get back to my original question,
Yes.
how would you contend with a case like me, someone who's trying to figure out the truth, actively learning about Christianity and theism in general, and yet the arguments just haven't been convincing to me? Do you think it's something in my subconscious? Am I actually secretly resistant? And if it is in my subconscious or I'm unconscious of it, then how can I be held liable in the afterlife for my thoughts here?
The inconsistency is undeniable. Moral outrage is being expressed while simultaneously arguing that morality is subjective. But listen to how Cliffe tackles her imbalanced ideology.
Obviously, ma'am, I don't know what's motivating you. I think it would be incredibly judgmental for me to try and tell you what's motivating you. Here's what I would have to say to myself. All right, Cliffe, you have decided that there is not enough evidence for Christ. No problem, Cliffe. But listen to yourself talk. There's not enough evidence for me to believe in Christ, which means before I can accept anything, I must have X amount of evidence before I can trust. See what you're saying? You're saying there's not enough evidence for Christ. No problem, I understand. But what you're saying is, Cliffe, in order for me to live for Christ, this standard of evidence must be met. No problem.
Then comes the most brutal dismantling yet, where she brings in the historical context.
That meets that standard of evidence.
I recognize, obviously, like, Jesus is a historical figure.
Yeah.
I guess my problems are more like logical, like problems with theism in general, not necessarily just Christianity.
Okay, now
And I don't know exactly what would be convincing to me, if that answers your question better.
that last statement began to get at it, but ma'am, you still haven't answered the question. What are you living for today that is supported by enough evidence? In other words, what has more evidence to support it than Jesus Christ?
I personally don't believe in any religion.
Or philosophy?
I'm just trying to understand what
You
you're
bet.
asking, so
You cannot be a student at this fine university without being a pretty motivated person, which means you have priorities. It means you have ambition. It means you are living for something that you cannot prove to anybody is the truth. But you have attached a great deal of meaning to your life. That's why you dress in an orderly, beautiful way. That's why you articulate in an orderly speech. And that's why you're at this fine university. You're not here by accident. So what are you living for? In other words, what have you put your faith in? You've got faith. You can't prove to me that UConn's not going to say on your day of graduation, hey, guess what, guys? No diplomas this year. We're going to break tradition. No diplomas. It could happen. But obviously the evidence is that UConn does not do that.
As Cliffe explains, if morality is merely the result of evolutionary progress, then why was the 20th century the bloodiest in human history? The world, according to this view, should be improving as humanity evolves. But reality tells a different story. The regimes of Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and Adolf Hitler were responsible for more deaths than any religious conflict in history. If human morality is evolving toward progress, why do the most educated and scientifically advanced societies commit the worst atrocities? The idea that evolution naturally leads to goodness collapses under the weight of historical reality. But why until you see this part?
There's evidence. So, you've said to me, sorry, Cliff, not enough evidence to support Christ. No problem. Now, you've got to answer the question, if you're going to be intellectually consistent and honest, what is the option that is supported by more evidence than Christ that you're living for?
I think I just don't understand what you're saying, because I just want to say atheism. I think atheism has more evidence, but I sense that
you
I'm
can't
not
live as an
understanding
atheist.
your question.
All right, let's put it this way. This guy says to me, Cliff, why don't you believe in Jesus? And I say, because there's not enough evidence. And he says, okay, Cliff, then what are you living for? And I say, well, nothing. I'm not living for anything. I'm lying.
Okay.
Look
So,
at the
like,
way I'm
what do
dressed.
I value?
Yeah.
I value
Human value,
truth,
human meaning and purpose,
education.
ethics.
Yeah.
Okay, but what are you living for? And then what's the evidence that whatever it is you are living for is true?
I value like education and happiness.
And happiness?
I personally think you find meaning from your life by finding your own happiness. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
At this point, the student brings up a common fear. What if Christianity is true? What if rejecting it carries eternal consequences? This leads directly into Pascal's wager, the argument that believing in God carries no loss, but rejecting him carries infinite risk. If Christianity is false, believers lose nothing. If it is true, non-believers lose everything. The student resists, claiming that if the evidence were clearer, more people would be Christians. But once again, the argument is turned on its head. People reject truth not always because of lack of evidence, but because of their response to it.
Better decision than putting your faith in Christ.
I don't think I have that much like faith in the religious sense in myself. I try to do what I think is best every day, and sometimes that ends up being wrong. Sometimes that ends up being right. But I don't have to. I'm not saying that what I believe in and how I live my life is correct. I'm just doing the best that I can. I'm not trying to convince anybody else here of atheism, but you're trying to convince people here of Christianity. So I don't think I have to contend with the same things that you do.
Oh, come on. Come on now, you can see through that. Ma'am, you're doing something far more significant with your faith than standing out here and talking. You're living your life a certain way. You're treating people a certain way. You're handling money a certain way. You're handling education a certain way. You know very well.
With each argument, the floor continues to fall out from under the skeptic's position. The conversation has shifted from Christianity being unsupported to realizing that disbelief itself requires assumptions that cannot stand under scrutiny.
Money a certain way. You're handling education a certain way. You know very well that the way you live your life shows what you really believe about reality. You know, I'm not sure he's really standing here, okay? I'm not sure. I'm agnostic. I don't know. Right about now, I got to make a decision. Is the preponderance of evidence that pointing to his face starting right there, or can I really believe that his face isn't there, it's just an illusion I'm having? I'm agnostic. I don't know. Well, right about now, I'm going to have to make a decision. I have no choice. Ma'am, you live your life. You have to make choices. Is he valuable or is he trash?
I think human life is valuable.
Why? Why is human life valuable?
I'd say human life is valuable just because we can create meaningful connections and have relationships and have an overall positive experience in life, even if that means in the atheistic worldview that there's...
By now, the entire discussion is no longer about proving Christianity false. It is about exposing the shaky foundation on which atheism stands. Things took a different turn when that first student showed up again. This time, she nearly drove Cliffe Knechtle off the cliff. No pun intended. But watch how he dismantled her stiff opposition just as brutally.
That's exactly why I trust John, because he lived with Jesus. Muhammad was the dude who never met Jesus. John met Jesus, listen to Jesus.
But doesn't it come with time that things like that become more inaccurate? Jesus' book isn't here. Jesus' book is not here.
Yes, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written in the first century.
Okay, Moses' book,
eyewitnesses, that's what I want when it comes to historical knowledge.
Book, the Torah, right? Did Jesus believe in the Torah? Did Jesus follow Moses?
Yes, Jesus believed the Torah was the Word of God, very clearly.
Then why do you accept Jesus as a successor of Moses and you don't accept Muhammad as a successor of Jesus?
Because Muhammad contradicted.
What do you think about the way Cliffe destroyed these atheists? Kindly let us know in the comments. If you found this video enlightening, kindly like, subscribe, and share the links so others can find it as well.